After lunch, I thought I might just say that I came to second Jim Gebhardt's presidential address and sit down. Then my narcissism kicked in. And so I rationalized going ahead with this, but I thought, you know, we go to church, or at least I used to. We go to church. I still go to church, and we sing many verses of the same hymn. So let's just call this verse 2 of Jim Gebhardt's hymn, and I invite you all to write successive verses. 150 of them. Well, we've had, I think all of us, the dream for many years now, since we began 17 years ago, the dream of honorable collegial competition with our fellow sister collegial organizations in the field. And probably every year, I think in my report to you, I've said that we do not need to fight with our collegial brothers and sisters. We all have more than enough work to do. I'm sorry to report that the struggle with our two primary collegial organizations has heated up rather than cool down in the past year, and that some of you have been hurt by quite scurrilous attempts to discredit what we do and who we are. Part of the venom against us likely has to do with the fact that we did begin as a protest movement against perceived abuses in the old organizations, so in a way we can't blame them for a certain amount of hostility. But that does not explain the recent, rather severe escalation and in the antipathy toward us, and even the viciousness in attacks on us, attacking even our integrity. And I believe that has to do with our continuing and astonishing growth. The current strife is more than just a catfight among competitors. Substantive issues lie here too. It's very troubling that our competitors, our two real competitors are the Association for Professional Chaplains, APC, and the Association for Clinical Pastoral Supervision, ACPE. They're the only two multi-faith, interreligious certifying organizations in chaplaincy and pastoral supervision, and our only real competitors. But as long as our competitors posture themselves as the only legitimate multi-faith certifying organization in the field, the strife will continue, and in fact ought to continue. We can't let this happen. Monopoly is not good for anyone. The franchising of a single certifying body in any field should trouble the community. Diversity, biodiversity, is a value to be cherished. One species of tree, one species of bird, or one organization of religion, or one approved way of organizing a state. None of these things are blessings, they're curses. Diversity is a blessing. Nature loves diversity. Dare we say, God loves diversity. Else you all wouldn't be such a weird collection of people. Whatever one thinks of this community, the continuing efforts of the ACPE and the APC to position themselves as the only legitimate certifying bodies in their respective fields is not acceptable. The clinical pastoral movement began in diversity, as Cabot and Giles separated from Boysen and Dunbar over significant philosophical, pedagogical, and theological differences. And the CPE movement, the clinical pastoral movement, was never richer than in the years when the Institute for Pastoral Care and the Council of Clinical Training competed and dialogued with each other and promoted their differing philosophies. When the two communities merged into one in 1967, the pole of conformity and the silencing of dissent began in earnest, promoting a soul-destroying bureaucratic pretensions of sameness. Jim said the same thing at lunch. If CPSP did not exist today, we would need to create something like it in order to promote creative dialogue. CPSP represents some other markedly different values from our collegial organizations. Let's let history decide what truths each community brings. I doubt they will be entirely one-sided. I doubt that any one community will get everything right, even us. In dialogue with the many, even in the conflict, we can look for a deeper truth to emerge. But it is a melancholy fact that we have to go on struggling for the right to exist against those who should be our closest allies and partners in dialogue. Considering the context of the larger society that we live in that is deconstructing itself, as Jim pointed out so well at lunch, this is particularly regrettable. We cannot afford not to defend ourselves, nor can we afford to neglect those among us who have been specifically abused professionally. They require our care and attention, and I think we should say with one voice that we will give all the care and attention we can to those who have been hurt by the We also need to keep in mind that as we defend ourselves against slander and other assaults, not everyone among our opposing communities is committed to a scorched earth policy of eliminating competition. As we fight against perverse structures of domination, we must keep in mind that the humanity of those who are positioned as our opponents. We have many friends and well-wishers in these competing organizations. Above all, we must remain human and keep to the high ground even as we defend ourselves and our reputations. Now, when I started thinking about what I should say in my report to you, I framed I was going to make some points around what I consider our primary values and what we represent. And I was going to go in the direction of saying that CPSP is a community to promote clinical training of clergy and religious workers, and that our primary values centered around building no wealth, promoting not promoting ourselves, nurturing diversity as opposed to conformity, encouraging self-direction rather than submission to the will and dictates of others, particularly in bureaucratic structures, and that the value of promoting self-criticism and minimizing defensiveness as we share our work with each other, and that we would be committed primarily to theology in a culture that gives precedence in our field to psychology and not theology. I was going to work through those topics, and but I guess I'm going to let them go for another day, because as the more I thought about this meeting, the more I decided that I needed to comment, or thought I ought to comment, on what I consider serious ill winds blowing in church and culture. And I mean ill winds besides the efforts of our collegial organizations to franchise themselves and run sort of the marketplace. That's one ill wind. But four other ill winds that I'm calling them out concern me, and I've decided to mention them, list them. But before I do that, let me lighten up a little bit and say some good news. For 17 years, we've been the shrimps of the clinical pastoral world. I was listening when the 5-6 denominational representatives said at lunch that they were glad to be here, and they were here, and it's the first time we ever invited them. Well, we never invited you before because we were afraid if we invited all the denominational representatives that they would outnumber us. Whereas the ACPE, for example, has been contracting in membership over the past 25 years. 25 years ago, there were almost 1,000 certified supervisors. Today, I believe the number is 536. Now, numbers are not everything. Numbers are not even much. I would rather have 10 strong, committed women or men than 1,000 duds. So numbers are not really don't tell us a lot. However, they do tell us something. And I'm happy to report today that this is the first meeting in 17 years that we have more certified persons in CPSP than the ACPE does. In all fairness, we have many categories, clinical chaplains and supervisors, and they're simply supervisors. Nevertheless, that's a landmark in our growth, in my opinion. So our detractors will have a harder time from now on repeating the mantra that goes out on the websites and in the literature that we are not one of the major organizations in the clinical pastoral field, since we now outnumber at least 2 of the ones of the 4 they call major, though numbers. The second good news I want to report to you, I consider good news, is that we still travel light. We don't stress the environment too much. For comparison's sake, the ACPE's national budget, with its 536 supervisors, is $1 million a year, give or take 100,000, and that's not including regional budgets, which I haven't totaled them, but I think they probably come close to $500,000, give or take 100,000. This is all cost of the central office, supported by dues, fees, gifts, whatnot. So that it basically costs the national office, it costs the organization costs are about $3,000 a year per supervisor. $3,000 a year to maintain a supervisor in the national organization. In CPSP, it costs about $100 a year. The reason for that is that we've had no paid leadership whatsoever. We paid only for secretarial support. And the leadership, you know, when leadership goes on payroll, at least in this kind of organization, two things happen. Audacity tends to disappear and peership vanishes. Leaders in this kind of organization are risk averse when the salaries of leaders are at stake, and no one is peer with someone who pays her salary. If you paid me $150,000 a year, I guess it's less than the going rate, I would be compromised. And each of your dues would be increased by at least $300 a year. Now, I know you wouldn't mind compromising me, but I know damn well you wouldn't want to increase your dues to $300 a year. But the reason we don't stress the environment is that we have an astonishing array of leadership all around the community. And I don't want to offend anybody because I can't name everybody in the room, but I just want to highlight a couple of people, and please forgive me, those of you whom I don't mention. But I'm sure none of us quite realize how much, say, Jim Gebhardt, who's in private practice and being here this week, he makes no salary, and he doesn't get leave time for meetings, and he doesn't get his air ticket paid even. And the amount of hours he spends away from patients, working for CPSP. I mean, we are in a debt of gratitude to Jim Gebhardt and to Charles Kirby, the treasurer, who does spend a tremendous amount of time keeping the books and the records and the money and the bank dealings and so forth. Barbara McGuire, who spends a tremendous amount of time doing the registrar work. Perry Miller, editing the pastoral report and being a consultant. He doesn't have any other hobbies. And Richard Liu, who is our international Johnny Appleseed, going from the Bahamas to Malaysia to Canton and God knows where else, springing up chapters all over the world. We couldn't buy this kind of service. You all applauded before I got to thanking John Edgerton for all the work he put in for this meeting, and Foy Ritchie for evangelizing the Rocky Mountains, and George Hall for controlling the internet, and on and on and on. There are many other people, but anyway, we and all the people are left out. Forgive me. Many of you do little things and acts of leadership that we'd spend a lot of time talking about it. Now back to the ill winds that I was referring to. There is a move afoot to professionalize the chaplaincy in this country. On the face of it, a benign idea, but in fact, in my opinion, a worrisome one. The argument goes like this, to quote from the ACPE website: chaplains have skills, congregational ministers have gifts. Now, this is a revolutionary argument. Up to the present, ministers with clinical training or equivalent have been considered appropriate candidates for institutional positions. The new argument sets certified chaplains over against congregational ministers as a separate profession. This is not only a mistake, it's patently false. There are competent, clinically trained ministers in congregations all over this country who are every bit as trained and as skilled as a typical trained chaplain. We don't need a new profession. We need ministers in congregations and in institutions who know what they're doing. And clinical training is a very good route for learning how to do what a minister needs to do to be effective and therapeutic. It may not be the only, it is not the only route. We need clinically trained congregational ministers and clinically trained institutional chaplains, and the distinction between the two is negligible to none. Any congregational minister not competent to provide care and counseling at the bedside of a dying patient, whether at home or in hospital, should undertake clinical training or find a different kind of work. The scheme for professionalizing chaplaincy, the motive is to build up protective fence around chaplains as this new delineated profession in order to control the market. And more particularly, to nurture the hope that one organization controlling the market. We do not need a new profession, and we do not need one organization controlling the field. I consider that an ill wind blowing in church and culture. The second ill wind, as I see it, an even more destructive one, is the impetus to put an end to pastoral counseling altogether in American religious communities. This campaign has spread like a lethal virus throughout the American churches and seminaries. It is driven by the insurance industry, impelled by a spate of lawsuits against churches, lawsuits that have mostly been sparked by allegations of sexual abuse. So the industry's solution is to inhibit ministers from being behind any closed door with anyone for very long. This is another case of burning down the house to roast a pig. Extended pastoral conversation, pastoral counseling, pastoral psychotherapy, however it's characterized, is the heart of ministry in every religion. It is the principal context in which the cure of souls takes place when it takes place. When it is abandoned, what is left of ministry? Community organizing, liturgical leadership and preaching, fundraising, bingo. This is a catastrophic abandonment of the historic mandate of religious workers. Better that all the churches would lose all their financial holdings in litigation than that we abandon the mandate to engage in private, extended private conversation and counseling behind closed doors, which is the principal locus of the cure of souls. The new rule going around the seminaries is something like this: after 3 sessions, refer. No one ever says where these people are going to be referred to or who will pay the fee. It's not just the churches that are affected by this, it's the whole culture. It's the time we live in, the hysteria over sex abuse. Some of you know my 8-year-old daughter, Lauren, or you've seen her at these meetings from time to time in previous years. My wife likes to say that her husband, that's me, my wife likes to say that her husband is in love with an 8-year-old. And that's about the case of it. Well, anyway, Lauren is taking piano lessons now for a couple of years. And we are required by law, the law requires, or the agreement with the teacher requires that one of the parents sit and observe every piano lesson. Lauren is not allowed to be alone in the room with her adult male piano teacher. And I've substituted for my wife from time to time and sat in trying to be as invisible as possible. I feel like a voyeur. Lauren loves her teacher. And it's nice to see, but I'm an intruder. I can't imagine when I was taking piano lessons having my mother sit and watch. I mean, that would be the end of it. This is an abomination. And when is this going to stop? When she gets to be a statutory adult at age 17, when adolescence is in full bloom, and then we leave? Is that a signal that she can... what are we saying what is Lauren going to learn from this? Are we going to chaperone her until she's safely delivered into the arms of her legal husband? Is she going to be allowed to be alone with any adult? And when? Fate has deposited us all in a particularly American, sex-drenched, sex-obsessed, and utterly sexually confused culture. And the cowering of religious leadership on this issue is dismaying. The quick surrender to the voices of hysteria and the willingness to quit pastoral counseling altogether without a fight is a disgrace, a black mark on the religious leadership of our generation. I urge you all to take up your cudgels and reassert the minister's ancient mandate to practice the cure of souls, a practice that demands private conversation, behind closed doors, every bit as much as a visit to your urologist. I hope you will join together in fighting against this particularly American neurosis of overreacting to anything, any sexual problem. Another evil wind blowing in the culture, as I see it, is the denigration of specific religious traditions in the institutional context, chaplaincy context, in favor of a mostly ill-defined spirituality, the substitution of spiritual care for pastoral care. A stated rationale for this change is the alleged association of pastoral with Christianity and the desire to avoid religious imperialism. That's a poor argument. All religions have teaching and shepherding components. Pastoral is a perfectly sound, multi-faith word. Someday a better word may be found, but it will not likely be spiritual or spirituality, in my opinion. Now, all institutional chaplains, as you all know, wear to some extent two hats. And the hats should be clearly differentiated. Every chaplain represents some particular religious tradition, a Jewish rabbi, Catholic priest, Methodist minister. Wearing this hat, the chaplain should have no hesitancy in performing religious activities that a particular patient and chaplain may share, such as a priest saying the rosary with a Catholic patient, or even recommending the rosary be said with a Catholic patient. But every chaplain, every clinically trained chaplain, also wears the hat of generic chaplain who offers services to anyone, irrespective of religion or no religion at all. Wearing the hat of the generic religious consultant or pastoral counselor. In that role, many patients or clients care nothing about the chaplain's own religious affiliation. The patient typically or generally expects only a kindly, wise, skillful person, knowledgeable about religion generally, and trained in counseling. In wearing the latter hat, it is not appropriate, in my opinion, for a chaplain to introduce any specific religious practice, even prayer, unless requested by the patient, perhaps. And one who wears that hat of the generic chaplain cannot escape the necessity for clinical training or its equivalent. Without it, the chaplain is a menace. Now, this is complicated, but this is not to say that wearing the second hat, the chaplain has no religious rudder and is adrift on a multicultural, multi-religious sea. I don't mean to suggest that at all. In fact, I think that's not true. In this regard, the Jewish tradition has been most helpful and clear in providing the concept of the righteous Gentile, which I think informs us here. You know the concept, but Judaism promotes Jewish identity and specific Jewish practice, but it also takes the view that any person of godly behavior qualifies, no matter what religion he or she may be, for the label of righteous Gentile. And you remember the German Nazi, Oskar Schindler, who is buried in Jerusalem now, who risked his life under the Hitler regime to save a great number of Jews in World War II. Anyone who conforms to the requirements of justice, love, and mercy, etc., qualifies as a righteous Gentile. These are principles by which all religions are judged. These principles, which come directly from the prophetic tradition in Judaism, but elsewhere as well. So we should follow, in my opinion, Judaism and reject any religious practice that denies justice, or is abusive, or is bereft of compassion. We should reject any religion that tolerates, say, racial domination or abuse of homosexuals, or any other violation of the demands of justice, love, mercy, and humility. So I say that the mandate of every chaplain, whatever that religion, whatever the chaplain of that religion, or whatever hat a chaplain is wearing, that the mandate is to attend to matters of love and justice and all that comes under that heading, however they manifest themselves. And this is our ecumenical religious mandate. This is the standard by which all religions are judged. The mandate to attend to religious values, love and justice, the righteous Gentile issues, is the only mark that separates us from social workers and psychologists and other professions that are secular. The recently blowing ill wind that proposes to supplant all particular forms of religion with the new label of spirituality has two problems with it. One problem is we cannot afford to override or discredit by implication any specific religion, except insofar as it violates just principles of justice and love. That would be arrogant and abusive, and it would impoverish us. The rich diversity of religious expression should be values, diversity values. We should not sand down all the individual religions and try to make them into one kind of oblong blur. Quaker, Catholic, Sufi, Orthodox, putting them all in one pot and boiling them down to a common denominator is not a good idea. And certainly the attempt to supplant one religion for another is unacceptable. But what's happening in the culture that is equally troublesome is the move in recent decades to supplant all the particular religions with the oblong mush called spirituality. Spirituality, that recently emerging civic religion with no doctrine, no commandments, no prophets, and no substance. Or more precisely, I should say, spirituality carries a soft substance consisting of two doctrinal propositions. One should feel good, and secondly, one should feel connected to the divine, at no cost, of course. Well, spirituality and spiritual cannot be, the word itself in our current environment cannot be entirely avoided, and it would be incorrect for me to suggest that anyone ought to avoid the word entirely. Some of you have departments called departments of spiritual care. You should go to work Monday morning, George. So I don't want to be a literalist, but I do think we have a problem. Because the word does move us away from serious theology and serious values, and it moves us toward a feel-good religion that is all sort of solipsistic in the mind, and it connotes escapism from tough theological issues and tough theological discipline and obedience. All religions have requirements. Spirituality doesn't have any. The public loves spirituality because it's an escape from the world and from the social order that seems to be destroying us. So as long as I have any say in the matter, CPSP will never become the College of Spiritual Supervision. In case you think this is a theoretical problem, let me tell you a brief story of how theoretical it's not, or how practical it is. At the present time, at the National Institutes of Health in Washington, the chaplaincy department, they have a significant chaplaincy department at NIH. And the chaplaincy department at NIH has shipwrecked on the rocks of just what I'm talking about. The chaplain, several years ago, the chief chaplain, set out to sand down all the chaplains into spiritual care professionals, and in doing so, he was probably a little heavy-handed because he fired the Catholic priest and fired the rabbi and fired the Baptist minister and tried to clean house and replace everybody with spiritual chaplains who didn't have too heavy an identification with any particular religion. And Henry Heffernan, who was our honoree last night in the Helen Flanders Dunbar Award, was, I think, the first one fired in 2004. And he was fired basically because he's a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, and he argued for giving attention to the Catholic patients at NIH when they wanted Mass. He wanted to do Mass for them, and the pressure was put on him to visit everybody, Baptists, and the Catholics wanted to see a priest, they send a Baptist minister. I mean, they're generic. Erased all the distinctions between the... So he got in trouble for resisting this move, and they fired him in 2004. And the appeals process went along until about 2 weeks ago when he was reinstated to the NIH. But his reinstatement doesn't solve the problem. The chaplain department is still in disarray, and I'm not sure they know where to go with this. But this is a case where spirituality is the virus of spirituality, the fruits of the virus of spirituality are in evidence. Finally, let me say this. I'm finished with the ill wind. You all have heard enough about the ill wind. Finally, let me say, CPSP should not get too involved in self-promotion like the Gentiles. God forbid we become another corporate entity. I do not think we should even put our full energy in promoting clinical training as such, valuable as it is. The values we promote are deeper and broader and more profound. I have a vision of luring every religious worker in this country into a chapter. A chapter of CPSP or a chapter of something else like CPSP, where that religious worker can share her work clinically, her personal issues, her reading, her continuing education, and the chapter would essentially become the equivalent of clinical training, whether it was called that or not. If every religious worker in this country had such a nurturing and potentially confrontational context to relate to personally and professionally, we would create a revolution in this country. We ought to do that. We ought to put aside urges to self-promote and build a stronger CPSP. We are called to leave the world and the human community a more just and loving place than we found it. That should be our primary mission. And I think the chapter model is an idea whose time has arrived. It has magic powers. I have seen it. You put 8 people in a room who are committed and theologically informed, interested in making the world a just and loving place, and willing to share their work and take some lumps of criticism and not be too defensive. The results are magical. The chapter is an idea whose time has come. I think the more we can spread this around the country, the more likely we are to create a revolution. A revolution that cannot be accomplished by any one denomination or religion. It must be multi-faith. It must function alongside the judicatories, not in place of them. Well, sometimes we learn more, or I learn more, about how to promote the values of love and justice in the world from the arts than I do from religion itself. I was deeply moved 2 weeks ago when I went to see the current film Amazing Grace, a movie that my wife dragged me to see against my will. I didn't want to see another brutal slave ship movie, and it turned out not to be that. Amazing Grace is a moving and historically accurate account of a part of the life of William Wilberforce, who struggled mightily against all odds to abolish the slave trade in Great Britain in the early 19th century. Wilberforce was originally headed for the ministry, and instead he went to Parliament and gave his energy, his life, to eradicating the slave trade. He was encouraged by the former slave trader John Newton, who himself became a minister subsequently, and who wrote Amazing Grace. That's why the name of the movie, currently the most multi-faith in our culture. Wilberforce left the world a better place when he died. Whatever CPSP means to you and me, we should do the same. From our particular niche in the clinical pastoral field, we must insist that CPSP be not a self-serving community, but above all, an instrument for promoting love and justice in the world.